Today on the Magnalia podcast, we have Pierre Rochard with us to talk to us about Bitcoin, and especially Bitcoin and Christianity. Pierre, could you just start out by just briefly giving us your story about Bitcoin, but especially about Christianity?
Yeah, sure. So I got into Bitcoin before it existed. I was into sound money and Austrian economics starting in 2005. At the same time, though, I was also interested in open source software and Linux. And so I never thought those two worlds would intersect. I thought, I'll stack my silver while doing command line things and learning about code. And it wasn't until the end of 2012 when I heard about Bitcoin's sound monetary policy and that there would only be 21 million. And so that's when those two worlds did cross over, where it became apparent to me that given the transparency of open source software and the digital nature of this monetary asset and its greater scarcity than gold or silver, that it was going to gain adoption. And as it gained adoption on the demand side, the supply side wouldn't change, and so the price would go up. And so, as a college student, I had dollar signs in my eyes of, wow, this is going to increase in value, and it's aligned with my ethos and my kind of libertarian leanings. So that's on the Bitcoin side. Fast forward, I started a family, got married. Now I was actually, maybe instead of fast forward, I should rewind. I was baptized Catholic at the insistence of my grandmothers. And my parents were mostly just atheist, agnostic. So that's how I was raised. We never stepped foot in a church. And it was, they were not militant atheists that were like, railing against religious people or anything. It was just like a secular kind of, unfortunately, very normal kind of French family upbringing in the late 20th century. So then after I had started a family and we had our first child, we were getting ready for our second child, and as part of that, they to make to ease the birthing process, you work with a doula. And one of the activities that she had us do was a hypnosis session that was really centered around, forgiving each other. That, as a married couple, things accumulate, right? And so you want to make sure that to have a stress-free delivery, that everybody's feeling close and, there's no tension in the couple. And so that involves forgiving each other for our trespasses, as I'd put today. And that really was a breakthrough moment for me. And at the time, it kind of felt just like a self-improvement type thing of like, oh, okay, this is good practice to have to be forgiving of your spouse. And I also, as part of that, the doula had us listening to New Age music. This musician called Stephen Halpern, and he's got this whole album called Theta Wave, and I felt like the music really helped us to kind of be in this space to meaningfully forgive each other. And so I also liked it as just relaxing music. So I would just put it on in the background while I was coding for work, right? But one day I was listening to this and I was staring out the window, and I had this thought pop into my head of Jesus died for our sins. And I thought to myself, like, what does that mean? It's kind of like it's a meme that obviously I think everybody in Western civilization at some point has heard that phrase in whatever context. So now I see it as the Holy Spirit kind of planting that in my head at that point. But I go on Wikipedia and I read the article about Jesus Christ, and at that point, at the end of it, I was crying and thinking yes, I am a Christian. I understand. I understand the meme now, that this person really did die for our sins, and at that point, I still I wasn't properly catechized or anything, so I had lots of thoughts about who Jesus was. But one thought I had was that even if he wasn't divine, let's say he's not a divine being, that he ought to have been, that right. He had to have been to be such a profound catalyst for helping people realize this truth, that he said on the cross of "Forgive them, for they know not what they do," which to me was the of all the things he said in his ministry, that's the one that struck me as connecting to that experience I had of forgiving, my wife. Then, zooming out of my children are so innocent, and a major part of their innocence is that they don't know what they're doing. So even if they're doing something wrong, it's very innocent in what they're doing, and that I can apply that. And Jesus asked us to apply that to a broader audience than just our children. So that really got me very interested in learning more about Christianity. And I started reading different perspectives, because at that point I wasn't set on I was baptized Catholic, but it's not like I had any profound allegiance to the Catholic Church. It was more just my faith tradition. But I wanted to understand what all the different streams of thought on Christianity were, and to see where I landed intellectually, and also, spiritually. And read lots of different books and articles, and really I did vibe with the Catholic perspective on a lot of different points, and that's where I really felt like in terms of what church I belonged to, it was the Catholic Church that coincidentally I was baptized into. So that's in a nutshell my faith journey. In parallel, interestingly enough, so my wife also grew up secular agnostic, but came from a Jewish faith background. Of her grandparents were what we would call Orthodox Jewish today, and that she at the same time rediscovered her faith as well. And so we spent lots of time watching YouTube videos of Orthodox rabbis, essentially doing exegesis on Old Testament passages, or what I would call Old Testament, right? What they would call Torah, and doing the weekly parshas, and we're raising our children Jewish as well. We can talk about that, but that was the other part of it, where now we fell into an interfaith relationship, even though we started out both not thinking about religion at all.
Right. Well, we'll come back to some more interesting theological questions and how they intersect with Bitcoin. But you've worked in Bitcoin for a long time, and from different aspects of the Bitcoin world and industry. What are some of the hardest things for what Bitcoiners would call normies, regular people, non-finance, non-libertarian, non-technical? What are some of the hardest things for them to understand about Bitcoin, or the most understandable things for them to stumble over?
Yeah, so when we hear people talk about Bitcoin as a virtual currency and as tulips or Beanie Babies, in some ways they don't see it as being real. ontological level that it's almost like they do see it as something that's more in the spiritual realm. That it's not physical zeros and ones in the computer, and that it's just virtual, which I get it. If you contrast it with like a physical piece of gold, right, that's tangible, that so I think that's maybe the hardest part for people to wrap their minds around, is the lack of a physical nexus, and so it does represent a leap of faith, if we can use that word. So there's that part, and then there's lots of things that are downstream of that. So, for example, that it can be easily replicated. That, oh, well, what's to stop someone from starting another cryptocurrency? Already there's millions of other cryptocurrencies, so why is Bitcoin special? I think that is challenging for normies. And then, of course, the price being so volatile that they just categorize it as something that's speculative. It's a lottery ticket. It's not, at best, it's a get-rich-quick scheme. At worst, it's a pyramid scheme.
Yeah, and here at Magnalia, we work quite a bit with churches, trying to help them think through Bitcoin and why it might be wise for them to save a little bit of their money in it to help them weather the storms of inflation and debasement. They're quite worried about volatility. It's hard for them to, many churches struggle to function from month to month, meet their budgets. You and your wife have done some work with advising people on their own budgets and kind of how to deal with those kinds of things. How do you respond to people, and how would you respond to churches who are saying, well, even if I think this is a good idea, I don't have extra money laying around for this? How do you communicate about the volatility of it?
Yeah, so I think that on the budgeting aspect of it, I think that's where there is a tremendous challenge, which is that on one hand, we want to meet the needs of today, and on the other hand, we want to be good financial stewards and be thinking about the long term of the needs of tomorrow and 5 years from now and 10 years from now. And so, if we look at but I think that's been a challenge in a lot of religious contexts. So, like, on one end, you have the Mormon Church, where I think that they have heavily emphasized the long-term stewardship, and so they've accumulated all of these financial resources and physical resources, and so and then further towards the middle. The Catholic Church has invested a lot in let's say, the beauty of its churches, and then it might be subject to criticism of, hey, why are you not using that wealth to help the poor today, and instead whether it's the Vatican Bank accumulating resources or just churches investing in their real estate, essentially. And then on the other, when we look at Christ's ministry of, when he tells, just like sell all of your belongings and follow me, and kind of detach yourself from the material world entirely, and that doesn't lend itself to saying, oh, you should be accumulating assets and to be investing for the future. So I think that there's a theological conversation around financial stewardship that tries to thread that needle between today's needs and tomorrow's. Because ultimately, in order to hold Bitcoin, you do have to spend less than you earn today to make a sacrifice today in order to reap the rewards in the future. I do like the parable of the talents in that regard, but that's that's the first challenge, is to just have positive cash flow, to put it in financial terms.
Yeah, and I think it's understandable at some level. We hear sometimes from churches, well, why are you focusing on this? We are not here to make money. We're not a business. We don't want to spend our time managing investments. And that's true, and that's understandable. because, yeah, they do want to be doing ministry, and Protestants especially can be overly pragmatic in terms of just do the cheapest thing possible. It's all about getting the most ministry done, however hideous your building or however poorly you pay your minister. But there is a level of it where it is understandable, because it's like, well, okay, yeah, you don't want to be just sitting there managing an investment fund, especially if you're a smaller church and can't afford to hire someone to help you with that. Sometimes you'll hear churches say, well, if they do have a building, sometimes they don't, but if they do have a building, they say, well, the value of our real estate's going up. And, down the road, if we ever have to sell the building, we can get some money that way. I heard somebody one time describe most mainline Protestant denominations in America as not so much churches as they are real estate management companies, because they are in, terrible decline, and they can just kind of survive forever because they have all these old buildings that they just sell off over time to get more money to keep themselves barely alive. How does something like Bitcoin help change people's attitude and churches' attitude towards real estate? Why might it make sense for them in terms of not wanting to be constantly focused on investing and managing money, actually as an easy way to be a good steward?
Yeah, so I think that one of the reasons why I was able to how to put this to regain my faith, or to really put it in Protestant terms, to be born again, was that with Bitcoin there's a heavy emphasis on because you're not spending for today's needs, and frankly, let's be realistic about the first world problems that we can have here in the United States, which is that with a decent enough salary out of college, all thanks be to God, I had enough to not have to worry about, do I have enough money for food and for shelter? And it's really about, do I have enough money for a vacation? And what kind of vacation am I going to have? Or what kind of car am I going to own? Or how much square footage am I going to buy for my house? And so with Bitcoin, it's saying, well, try to minimize all of that so that you have enough left over to buy Bitcoin, because the value of it is going to increase so much that, in the future you'll be able to have a bigger house. And so it's about, lowering today's expenses to the benefit of, at some point in the future. And so and to just, even like order less junk off of Amazon. And that frees up time, because now you're not spending your time comparison shopping, or even, spending your money at the bar on alcohol. Vices are expensive, right? Sinning is expensive in some regards. And that then it creates a vacuum, because you're not spending your time on those things, and you're just trying to stack sats, and that's not time consuming. You're just buying Bitcoin. And so it reduces your materialism. And I think that's really what made space for an increase in spirituality. And so I think that almost from a shepherding the flock perspective of saying, hey, one way to help you sin less would be for you to save more. And that, in a context where you're earning enough money for that to be an option, and you're not living paycheck to paycheck, and that's thanks to God, and thanks to the market economy we live in. That's a realistic proposition for a lot of people, that they can save more. They just need to kind of change their mindset of keeping up with the Joneses, moving to the nicest neighborhood they can afford, and like using their house as a savings vehicle, that they can actually change their mindset there, and also that can give you more resources to tithe with as well, both in the short and the long term, and that if I think that if you have parishioners who are increasingly focused on just stacking sats and reading the Bible, that then the community has more resources to put towards Bitcoin as a whole. That's maybe an avenue that makes sense.
Right. And one thing we've come across too is I think people, it sounds too good to be true that you can just stack your sats, you can just save a little bit of Bitcoin and just, you don't have to do anything. It just sits there and it grows in value over time. I think people are so used to this idea that if you want to have more wealth for the future, you have to run around like a crazy person, investing and buying and selling and managing. And it's so simple, it's hard to believe that you can really do it. It sounds like it's a scam to people.
Yeah, there's a meme of like focusing on your craft and stacking sats. And so you're right that we're used to thinking of like, you have to become a professional landlord to be and to be managing your stock portfolio and trading around and things like that. And it brings it back to basics. I think a lot of plebs on X have this mindset that, you know, like if you're in the trades, if you're in construction, like focus on being the best at construction and don't worry about your investments, just, you know, stack sats. And that it simplifies that part of the equation so much that you can focus on your trade. You can also focus on your family, on your faith, and have more time for that rather than researching stock investments or researching the real estate market.
Right. Yeah, a little while ago, you were talking about how people get a little wary hearing about money. The Bible has these very strong warnings about the dangers of focusing on wealth. Jesus obviously has some very hard things to say about money and how we should relate to it and the dangers that come with it. As a Christian, how do you respond to people who think that focusing so much on money and wealth is immoral, suspicious, kind of unspiritual? What would you say to them?
I would say that moderation is a virtue, and so on one hand, there is the sin of avarice and of being overly focused on money. I think that is a problem if it's to the detriment of the balance that we have to have of. On the other hand, we do live in this world, and in this world, we do have to think about the money does alleviate a lot of suffering in the sense that it enables the division of labor by being a medium of exchange, so that we're not having to barter with each other. And so I do think that it solves a real problem, and that we have to take it seriously. We can't just say that, oh well, and I think it's true of like food, for example, right? Like gluttony is a sin as well. So people who are overly focused on food, that's a problem. But that we all have to eat, and that food is good as well. So, and same thing with sex, right? That lust is a sin. If we're overly focused on that aspect of it, that's a problem. But that reproducing and life are and having a loving relationship with your spouse and within marriage is a beautiful thing as well. And so it's all about finding what is the healthy version of each of these human activities, and where do we fall into sin, and drawing that line. And that's where it takes a lot of prayer and discernment to find the nuances there.
Yeah, I think often of the end of 1 Timothy, when Paul is instructing Timothy about how to run this church in Ephesus, and he says, okay, as for the rich Christians, make sure you instruct them to be generous. But then he goes on. He doesn't just stop there and say they should give away all their money and be generous, and therefore there's no rich Christians left. But he says they should be generous. They should learn about the wealth that really will last, not this world's wealth. Then he also says, they need to do it as those who understand that God gives us everything to enjoy. And he assumes that there will continue to be rich Christians in the church, even with their generosity and with their appropriate relationship to money, and that they will be enjoying it, that it's not one or the other. Either you have money and you're enjoying it, or you're being a good Christian and you're giving all of it away and there's nothing left to enjoy. Paul says, no, those both exist side by side. Or like, you mentioned the story of the rich young ruler where Jesus, kind of zeroes in on his heart and says, well, you need to give away everything to the poor, and then you can follow me even if you're keeping all the laws. And I think it's in Luke's gospel. The very next story is about Zacchaeus, the tax collector, and also a notorious rich guy who accumulated a lot of wealth through a lot of wicked behavior. And he repents and he tells Jesus, I'm going to give away half of my wealth. And Jesus says, that's great. That's wonderful. The kingdom is here. And so you have one guy who Jesus says, give away everything. Another guy who says, I'm going to give away half of it and keep the other half, which is probably still a lot compared to most people in the first century. And Jesus says, oh, that's wonderful. That's great. Or he has stewards or patrons who, fund his ministry. He has a treasurer who keeps track of the money for him. The biblical attitude towards wealth is not this simplistic, run away from it. Don't do anything with it. Don't touch it.
Root of all evil.
Right.
Mammon, right? You can't serve both. And I also think that it's a crucial aspect of it is always reminding ourselves that our wealth does not belong to us. It does belong to God, and that we're just stewards of it here. And so, right. Not letting it feed into our ego of, oh, this is mine because I earned it. But it really is a gift from God, and that we have we're called to do good with it, and that can take a lot of different forms, and it's not necessarily just because I also think that charity also has issues within it of respecting the dignity of the person receiving the charity, how to go about it in the right way that does not create maybe unhealthy relationships of dependency either, but that we're really lifting each other up. So I think that on that side, it's also not just clear cut that giving away all of your wealth to the first person that you see that is struggling, that has solved a problem. It might have made the problem worse, right? That person might have a drug addiction problem, and then they go spend all of that money, right? So I'm not saying that's, I'm just saying that there's nuances there as well on that side.
Right. I was recently preparing on a sermon, and I was reading St. Augustine's homilies on 1 John, and he had this amazing passage where he was talking about how love and pride can manifest as the same outward action. And the example he gave is he said, there is a prideful, selfish way of serving and caring for the poor, to where you may be giving them resources and meeting physical needs for them, but you actually are doing it to focus on yourself and to celebrate yourself. And he says there's even a danger that you are doing it in hopes that they stay poor. You want them to remain poor so that you can keep helping them and keep patting yourself on the back. I thought, wow, he was writing this in the 5th century, but it sounds like so many, infamous welfare programs that just perpetuate themselves forever and ever and ever, and are designed in many ways to keep people poor and to keep them dependent on these programs that are very far away from local communities and networks.
Yeah, that's very, it transcends time.
Yeah, not a new problem. Let's do a little bit more on kind of Bitcoin and Christianity. But more generally, Christians believe that God has created the whole world as a reflection of himself. Everything reveals him to everybody all the time. In what ways do you think Bitcoin reveals God or reveals his character?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think there's the question of I'll go even to a greater level of controversy here of So I think God creates every moment, and I don't buy the kind of the watchmaker type approach. I really think he's involved in every moment, and that if Bitcoin came into the world, and I'm not gonna immediately jump to Satoshi Nakamoto is the second coming of Jesus or anything like that, but that at the very least he allowed the invention of Bitcoin at this point in time, and I do think that it's because there was a serious problem with the monetary system that man had created before that, of the fiat system that was detached from gold. So I think that there's a where to even go with this? So one is, in the beginning there was the word. I think Bitcoin's really interesting when we talk about when you hold your private keys, it's words. It's 12 words or 24 words. And so it's a dematerialization of wealth. And that in itself, I think, is a really interesting, we can call it a parallel with how important language is to Christianity and to God, that we're now in a world where wealth is not just physical things, but it's actually words. So there's that. There's also that we often point to the fact that it's a personal God, and there's we can look at the self-sovereignty aspect of Bitcoin, that it's a personal Bitcoin in the sense that you can run your own node, and that when you run your own node, you are a equal peer on the network of nodes, that there is no you have a direct connection to the network, which is, I think, also an interesting parallel to Christianity. We can get into a debate about that with Catholicism and all that, but there's I don't know if that was the direction you were going in with the question, or if you want to course correct.
No, that's great. I just want to hear you speak to that. And is there anything about Bitcoin you think that speaks to Christ, or what does it have to do with Christ more specifically? Not just thinking about God kind of in the abstract, or God is kind of a distant creator, but what about Jesus himself? How do you see the connection between Bitcoin and Jesus? I
actually do, in my mind, keep those things rather separate, in the sense that I don't think that that Bitcoin somehow supplants Jesus and Christianity, or that it's somehow a third covenant of some kind, right? Because I think that, to me, the central aspect of Christianity, in my mind, is the economy of grace, and that does not change with Bitcoin, in the sense that, like, Bitcoin is very unforgiving, and that if you lose your private keys, you destroy your 12 words, you're not you're not getting those back. That won't be forgiven by the Bitcoin network. Like, and so in a way, it's much it doesn't have, like, you're not going to find a savior in Bitcoin, and you are in Jesus Christ, and so that's where I really do draw a strong line between the two, and maybe I could be accused of, like, secularizing Bitcoin, but I do think the parallel is, like, fix the money, fix the world. And so in that way, you could say, Bitcoin's the redeemer of the monetary system, but it's not the redeemer of our lives, if that makes sense.
Right, right. Or, yeah, Bitcoin is not going to die for your sins the way that
Right.
Jesus has. And you could say too that, gravity is also unforgiving in its own way. And in its proper realm, gravity or Bitcoin or sound money or whatever, is something like, yes, this is part of how God has created the world. He's created it to run in a certain way. It runs better this way. If we're dealing in the realm of ethics and of ordering society. But Christianity is a lot more than ethics. Christian ethics is ultimately driven by Christian theology of who is God, who is Christ, what's the incarnation, and like you said, this radical invasion of grace from the outside, something that humans could not build up for themselves. They can't manufacture a way back to God, having ruined things so badly. And I wonder too, one of the strong points of Bitcoin is this connection to the real world compared to so many of the other cryptocurrencies that are out there that are abstractions or that can be kind of changed at will. I wonder too if there's some good stuff there to reflect on in terms of the incarnation and how in the incarnation God has entered into his own creation and is connected to it. God's love for his creation, his love for the physical world, with taking on human flesh in the womb of Mary, and in the resurrection, not just that Jesus died and then kind of disappeared and oh well, but that he returns in a body and he will give us our bodies back. It's one thing I think about often too, is that even though Bitcoin is a digital thing and in one way it's a non-material thing, it is deeply connected to the physical world and the real world by way of energy expenditure. And so, yeah, I think about that sometimes too, the connection between Bitcoin and the incarnation.
Yeah, and well, I just want to zoom in here, like literally zoom in, because my previous role was as a vice president of research at Riot Platforms, which is one of the largest Bitcoin mining companies, and I did a deep dive on what is electricity. Because it's just so central to the mining process, the proof of work, and I think that the explanation I had in my mind was that, well, you have a magnetic process at the power plant that moves the electrons to the consumer of electricity that consumes these electrons and then does some kind of work. And then when I started digging under, okay, well, what does that mean? Like, how does that actually work physically? I found out that was completely false. That's not what's happening at all. In fact, physically, the electrons are moving in the opposite direction very slowly. And that what's moving in the flow that we would think of as energy is this what are called virtual photons, and the reason why they're marked as virtual photons is because they are the result of a mathematical equation that where there's a missing piece, and so they fill in that gap by saying, "Oh, this is the virtual photon here," as kind of the plug in the equation, and they can't be observed. So then I was like, oh, okay. So, the scientists, they don't know what electricity is. And it just reminded me of, we can always try to, as humans, like, yes, the world is intelligible and God has given us this great opportunity to learn a lot. But we still don't really have a solid explanation. At some point, things fall apart, and we're hand waving of, yeah, something's happening here.
I read something last year about astrophysicists and theoretical physicists, kind of reaching this point more and more of basically, I don't know if they're calling it God, but basically that there has to be some kind of God behind all this. And one of them said, yeah, we've been doing all this work thinking that we are going to explain everything and that we could, wrap our heads around the entire universe and how it works. And it's really what it's like is you finally climb to the top of this mountain and you realize the theologians have been sitting there for 1,500 years ahead of you, and that they were right all along. I thought, whoa. You kind of in the modern world, you have this idea that science is this great liberator from religion and from superstition, and that we can wield it to control the world and understand the world, when actually you can never escape from God. You can never escape from his work in front of you and before you and behind you, ruling all things and taking care of all things. Christianity there's this really fascinating book by Tom Holland called Dominion about the history of the Christian church. And he I don't know if you've come across this book. He wrote it as a classicist who was fascinated with Christianity and kind of on the edge of it. Not quite a Christian himself, I don't think, but realizing that Christianity had created the modern world, not the Enlightenment. He had kind of grown up in this kind of secular attitude, rejecting the faith that he grew up with, thinking that science and the Enlightenment was what gave us all these wonderful things in the modern world, like human rights and care for the poor and science and all these things. And he realized, being a Roman historian, that the New Testament is radically different than everything else you find in the first century, in terms especially of Greek and Roman philosophy and ethics. And he talks in this book about how, in many ways, Christianity is very disruptive. It introduced many new things into the world that we now take for granted. But at the same time, there is deep undercurrents in Christianity that are very traditional, very conservative, don't blow up things. Christians generally in history have been very wary of revolution and of just overturning everything out there, because they know that often leads to much more harm than good. And so you have in Christianity kind of, in one way, it's a disruptive innovation in the world. In other ways, it's very traditional and conservative and slow. How does Bitcoin fit into that dynamic of Christian history and Christian kind of relationship to the world? Is it a revolution? Is it blowing everything up? Is it going to destroy everything? Or is this just a continuation? This is maybe reformation more than it's revolution. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
In what ways is Bitcoin disruptive? In what ways is it just actually pretty boring and traditional?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's lots of interesting parallels between Bitcoin adoption and the early church and the church fathers, and kind of how, from a sociological perspective, does a new idea spread, and especially one that is so contrary to the powers that be. So there's that. When I first started really thinking about Bitcoin, 2012, 2013, I had it in mind that it was such an obvious idea that it would, next year there would be hyper Bitcoinization, and that the fiat currencies would all be replaced by Bitcoin in short order. And that turned out to be completely false on one hand. On the other hand, it was somewhat true in the sense that, adoption continued, and that Bitcoin has increased in value, if we want to use that as a proxy measure for Bitcoin adoption. And that also, if I had been correct, that would have been very disruptive to the financial lives of people who, for lack of a better way of putting it, like, they don't deserve to have their lives disrupted financially. Things have, now my thinking is that we actually have to find a way to make this as non-disruptive as possible for the most number of people as possible, if we want to do the most good. How do you swap out the backbone monetary system mid-flight without crashing the plane? And that's I think the challenge, that when I look at, for example, the strategic Bitcoin reserve, it's the parallel in Christianity would be going from the persecution of Christians, right, in the circus, which was Elizabeth Warren sicking the lions onto the Bitcoin miners, to is Trump the Constantine who is adopting Bitcoin as the official state money, and that in the history of Christianity was a challenge of how do we have a Christianity that is not oppressing non-believers, right? Because that is a problem. We don't want to be, if somebody is not interested in Bitcoin, like, we don't want to impoverish them just because their natural inclination is to be skeptical of Bitcoin. We want to find ways to have Bitcoin under the hood and have it be benefiting them without them having to consciously adopt it. That's kind of the philosophy I have now on Bitcoin, which on one hand it's less radical than, oh, we're going to overturn the monetary system, flip the table, so to speak, and have everybody using their hardware wallets and their own Bitcoin node. But I also I think that like we don't need to do that. Like, why where does that come from? Other than I would argue a form of pride, right? Of wanting to be disruptive. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it, but that's kind of where my thinking is at, and why I'm pursuing the entrepreneurial endeavor I am.
Yeah, no, I think coming across a lot of Christians and churches, if they've heard of Bitcoin, they've usually heard about it from very bombastic libertarian types, and they associate it with drug dealers, and it just sounds so revolutionary, and it scares them, I think, to think of, that what they thought was just the normal financial system is actually totally unstable and doomed to fail, and it's going to cause all kinds of pain and damage. And oh yeah, and here's a bunch of libertarians with their, magic internet money. It's scary to normal people, and I don't think they want to think about.
I would argue that was true for Christianity in the early days as well.
Right.
It also it did trickle up. It was kind of a trickle up phenomenon. It didn't start in the elite circles of Rome, and that it there would. Well, so, I mean, on the Jewish side, saying, starting with Jesus himself saying that, he was going to tear down the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, that part, radical. And then also just the empire, on the Roman side, that the empire's hegemony was predicated on the state religion of the gods, and that, they would even blame military failure on Christianity, undermining kind of, let's say, Mars or whatever it was.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and it's you had the Romans accusing the Christians of being atheists, not in the way that we think of atheists, but because they refused to worship the Roman gods. And the Jews had been given kind of a special exception because we kind of get it. You guys are a little odd. You have this monotheism thing. Okay. But you have these Christians that show up and they say, well, we're Jewish too. And we also are not going to be worshiping the Roman gods. And they said, well, what do you mean you're Jewish too? That doesn't make any sense. And so this is where you have all this controversy in the New Testament about food laws and circumcision and what does it really mean to be Jewish or not. But yeah, the Christians very quickly start running into all kinds of problems because they say, well, we'll pray for the emperor, but we won't pray to him. And the Romans say, well, that's not good enough. You have to be willing. You can have whatever gods you want. You can pray to Jesus all day long. That's fine with us. But you need to pray for the emperor as God too and pray to him. And they said, no, we can't do that. And this, really created a lot of problems for them because they were accused of being unpatriotic, atheistic. You're against our society. And the Christians all along are saying, no, we're actually here to heal your society. We're here to bring life and healing to it. And it's your gods that are destroying everything. And in some ways, obviously Christianity and Bitcoin are, infinitely distant from each other in terms of cosmic eternal importance. But there is a parallel there to where Bitcoin is disruptive in a lot of ways. It seems radical and seems unpatriotic and, what's wrong with you? Don't you just support the way we do things? But there is a side of it too that is, no, we're here to actually heal what was here all along. And we're here to make things better for everybody. Bitcoin comes often with a big emphasis on being an individual, on being self-sovereign, on not having to trust anybody or trust anything. Do those kinds of emphases in Bitcoin go against the grain of Christian discipleship and Christian emphases, and how something like the Christian church works with lots of hierarchy and structure and having to trust people? How do you square those things as a Bitcoiner and as a Christian?
Well, if you're running your own Bitcoin node and you decide to change the code a little bit, suddenly you're not in consensus with the rest of the network. So, in a way, yes, you are self-sovereign. In another way, though, you're not sovereign at all. And you have to be in consensus with everyone else. And so I think there's a similar kind of dichotomy in Christianity as well.
Yeah, I can
And
see
that's,
that.
yeah. To me, the consensus protocol is like the profession of faith, right? What are the core tenets of Christianity, and that's what people end up aligning on, and then they can have disagreements at the edges on particular issues, which in Bitcoin we would call soft forks, or even just layer twos, or ideological differences in what. How strongly do we believe in not your keys, not your Bitcoin? Is it okay to own a Bitcoin-backed security? We get into how many angels dance on the head of a needle, as that was put at one point. Although I think that was more negative than I'm
Actually,
portraying.
I'm a fan of that question. People like to use that as to ridicule the scholastic theologians, but it's a good question. It's a question
Yeah.
about, do angels have bodies, and do they occupy space? And so to my dying day, I will defend that as a good question to be asking.
Where do you land on that question?
How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? I don't know.
Or the greater theological question of what
they
is the
have bodies?
nature of angels?
I am not, the Bible doesn't have a lot to say about angels. I am open to the idea that they have some kind of body, but not a physical body. I mean, they occupy space, and they are located to one area of space in a way that God is not, but in a way like we are. But I don't think they are physical like we are physical. So in that sense, yeah, I guess you could say they have a body, but not quite the way we think of body.
And can two angels occupy the same space? That does
I
that get to
would
the question
say
of
my
the?
hunch is no.
Okay,
They
yeah,
can't occupy the same space because they are limited in space in whatever way that can happen without a physical body that you can poke.
right, within their dimension.
Right.
Just as an angel couldn't occupy the same space as a demon,
Right.
right? That they would be fighting each other in that dimension.
Right. Yeah. And so even though, scripture and Christian history doesn't have a ton to say about angels, they thinking about angels and what makes angels angels versus people, it does help you really think through really seriously, what does it mean to be human? In what way am I more than an animal? But, to say less than an angel is not quite the right way to put it, because scripture says being human is greater than being an angel, and that humans are the pinnacle of creation. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's interesting too. I mean, I've thought about this sometimes in terms of just Bitcoin stuff and digital stuff and technology stuff. Because I think sometimes in the modern world, we tend to think that being knowledgeable or being powerful is what it means to be human. But if you bring angels or demons into the equation, you have to say, well, here are beings that are far more knowledgeable than we are and far more powerful than we are, but are not human and are not made in the image of God. Being made in the image of God is something far more than knowledge or power, and there's more to life than gaining knowledge or wielding power. But yeah, I don't know. You have any thoughts on that? We've wandered far afield, but this is strange, obscure branch of theology, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it.
I feel, in a pragmatic sense, when I so obviously being Catholic and praying the Rosary in the in the sorrowful mysteries when Jesus is in the garden and an angel comes to his aid. I find that very, very important to me. That it's like even Jesus needed an angel, right? So or benefited from it, or however you want to word it. And so I think that I don't call for their aid enough, and I know that when I do, I feel it, and so I do think angels are real, however we want to define that. Yeah.
In my kind of church background and world, there's a lot of people who are afraid to talk too much about angels and demons because it's been, in some branches of the Protestant world, been so overemphasized that where people become obsessed with demons and everything is explained by demons, everything's explained by angels. But you can overreact to that and say, well, I'm never going to think about it and never talk about it, which fits kind of with the modern focus on material things and on this world. And I've sometimes wondered in the Bitcoin world where we rail against the fiat system and all of the problems and the Federal Reserve, and if we could just introduce Bitcoin and sound money, it'll fix everything. I've sometimes wondered, okay, this will fix a lot of things, but our greatest enemies are not human institutions or government institutions. Our greatest enemies are spiritual forces of darkness who are not very affected by Bitcoin, if at all. And we need to wrestle more deeply with what is ultimately wrong with the world and what is ultimately our real enemy. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. I do think, though, that the incentives of the fiat system make it easier for the demons to corrupt souls,
Right.
and make it harder for the Holy Spirit to enter them, and for angels to sustain them and nourish them. And so,
There's definitely the physical world is deeply connected to the spiritual world. And so, yeah, I mean, that is a good point. And when Paul tells the Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians 10 or wherever it is, he says, hey, you should not be going and participating in these temple services with your pagan neighbors. Don't eat the meat as part of those services. And he says, you're going to have fellowship with demons if you do that. And he doesn't just say, he just said in chapter 8, oh yeah, when you go buy your meat at the market, it's okay if it was sacrificed to demons. You can still buy it and eat it. That's fine because everything belongs to God. It's all his meat anyways. But then 2 chapters later, he says, but don't you dare go to the temple and participate in these rites with your pagan neighbors because you're going to be fellowshipping with demons unawares. And so there is a sense in which, yeah, you can get yourself involved with demons, even if you don't mean to, that is very serious and very detrimental. But the flip side of that, too, is you can battle demons, so to speak, or you can avoid them through other aspects of the physical world or what you do with the physical world or with your body. And so, yeah, it cuts both ways, I guess, in terms of demons using things, but also God working spiritual things, perhaps through angels, through better things in the world. We have just celebrated the resurrection. This is just after Easter. Does Bitcoin undermine Christianity's emphasis on the material and on the physical and on this world being a digital, immaterial thing? Sometimes we hear people say, well, I like gold because it's physical.
Yeah. So, on that level, I think that you can always write down your seed word on a metal plate, and you have something that's physical. But the fact that the network exists in cyberspace, I think that has trade-offs. So the benefit that we get from that is that we're able to verify the whole monetary policy of Bitcoin and know exactly how many Bitcoin are on the ledger, and that also that the transfer of the Bitcoin, we can do it 24/7. It's a lot less expensive than having to ship something physically. I think that it's almost, it's teleportation technology, which does make it. It's like you can pray for somebody on the other side of the world, and that it's that globalism and universalism. I think there's a very Christian aspect to that, and so. The, the, but sorry, your question was more.
Well, like, we're living in a heavily digital world right now, and
Yeah,
there are a lot of things about that I think Christian leaders and theologians are rightly worried about in terms of how it disembodies us and detaches us
right.
from the real world and from real people. Is Bitcoin more of the same of that kind of Gnostic like detachment from the physical world, or is it something a little different, even if it's digital? You know what I mean?
Yeah. So I think that money should be detached from the physical world in the sense that the physical world should always be about the utility of the good in itself. And the good, I mean, like in an economic term. Um, and so when we turn physical things into money, like let's say gold, for example, that means that now we can not use gold as much for its intrinsic properties of jewelry or dentistry or electronics even, and that we're storing it up in a Fort Knox, collecting dust and cobwebs, and so in that way, I'd argue that money should not be physical, and that but I wouldn't call it Gnostic in the sense that. Would you agree that Gnosticism has an element of secret knowledge,
Right.
and that Bitcoin is one of radical transparency? Of you can see the source code, you see the whole ledger. The only secret is the private key, which is really what makes it excludable of establishing property rights and not coveting your neighbor's goods. And I like to remind people, Jesus knows your private keys. So don't don't mess around. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a sense too in which when you let money be sounder, when you let money be pure money, in terms of this immaterial abstraction, in some ways, it it allows for you to focus more on the real world, so to speak, on the physical world. Um, One of the insights of Austrian economics is that value is subjective. That we don't subscribe to this labor theory of value where things are worth however much work people put into them. We say no, that's not right. People pay a certain amount of money for things because they personally find it valuable or more valuable than other things. And that can worry a lot of people, and it worries a lot of Christians because that sounds like moral relativism, where you say, well, it's all subjective. And there's a lot of things that we'd say are not subjective. My ideas of God or of whether or not I can steal from my neighbors, those are not up to my subjective feelings or insights. But it is true with regard to money and to value that, yeah, that kind of value in that sense is subjective. And in that sense, it's immaterial, it's non-physical, but it allows you to do things better in the physical world. And it's a good thing. Okay, last question. Libertarians and Bitcoiners, and sometimes even Christians, are not often known for being very humble. Libertarians and Bitcoiners are often very excited about their unique insights, their secret knowledge that they've come across, and they kind of beat it over other people's heads, sometimes very arrogantly, very angrily and dismissively. Christ, of course, blesses the poor in spirit. He says you have to be like a child to enter the kingdom. He blesses those who mourn. Do you think that Bitcoin contributes towards humility? Is there a way that Christianity might temper pride among Bitcoiners, or a drive towards kind of utopianism?
This is something I struggle with a lot, and so when I think about my spiritual health, I do have to pray for more humility on an ongoing basis, and that it is a challenge because it's there's the temptation of I was right, you were wrong for the past 12 years, and so I'm smarter, etc. And so that is also, I think, why the Bitcoiners have this saying of "stay humble and stack sats." I think it's because we have a problem staying humble, and so that is certainly something I personally struggle with, and that I'd say that that's my greatest sin that I'm working on. Now, could have I been humbled by Bitcoin as well? Yeah, I'll have like expectations, like I was saying, that Bitcoin's going to take over, and then it doesn't, and so that's humbling. And also that the the other part of the humbling is Bitcoin does go up in value, and you realize that that didn't solve any problems, right? On a personal level, like let's say psychologically or spiritually, that it's not like, oh, okay, I'm doing better. I'm better off than I thought I would ever be, and but I'm not happier. And so the old adage of money doesn't buy happiness. I think that's where that is humbling, and it's like, okay, well, the whole is not Bitcoin sized. The whole is Jesus sized, and so when I'm thinking about the nativity, and that's to call up the love of poverty, I think that's like that's something that's really important to me in my spiritual growth. It's thinking about the fact that I would be okay if I didn't have anything, from a material or financial perspective, and kind of meditating on that, because otherwise I do feel like it gets to our heads, or in the opposite direction of looking, it's like, oh well, Michael Saylor, he's got 500,000 Bitcoin, and wouldn't life be better if I had 500,000 Bitcoin and a mega yacht? It's like, so that I think is where we can trip ourselves up, and then from the ideological perspective, that as libertarians, we do feel like we've got a truth that other people are not acknowledging, and there's kind of the hubris to that of, and this is something that I really it impacted me when I visited El Salvador last year, and that it changed my perspective on, because I was always more of an anarcho-capitalist of like, oh, we're going to have a society where security is actually a competitive market, and what I heard about in El Salvador was like that's basically what they had, and in practice that's everybody has to stay in their home all day because it's so dangerous outside, because when you don't have a monopoly on the use of force, then everybody's competing on the use of force. They're not competing on providing security services. It's turf wars between gangs. So that was humbling. As a libertarian, I thought to myself, well, maybe I don't have it all figured out. That human society is a little bit more complicated than I had in mind. Of, oh, we'll just have a completely free market for everything, and that there's a lot in terms of coordinating human institutions, that there's a lot more nuance to it, and that perhaps the founding fathers of the United States were wiser than I was in that regard. So yeah, that's always good ways to find humility there.
Right, yeah, and Christianity is infamous for its very grim view of the human heart and how deep a problem sin is. Augustine's big debate with Pelagius was over, you know, how bad is sin? Pelagius said, well, sin is just people following bad examples and making bad choices. and we all have ultimate freedom to decide to not sin. And if only we could fix people's environment and give them good examples around them and have good education, and everybody would choose righteous things all the time. And Augustine, told him, you don't understand how serious sin is. It goes a lot deeper than your will. It goes a lot deeper than the examples you have around you. And Christianity, maybe sometimes we can be too pessimistic and too unwilling to think about improving the world and helping the world, but we are and we should be skeptical of human attempts to fix everything in the world, and we don't expect it to happen on this side of the ultimate restoration of all things and the return of Christ. But yeah, I think, accept Bitcoin and pursue Bitcoin in hopes of fixing things where we can and helping things where we can, even if things, we expect them to not always go the way we hope and we want, and we expect that in some ways.
Yeah, and I feel like in my own life, as I address sins in my life, then I just find more sins underneath to address.
Right. Yeah. And I've as a pastor, one of the common things you deal with, especially with men, is pornography addiction. And I would sometimes tell these guys, I'd say, well, pornography is really bad and it's really destructive to your life and to your marriage. But in some ways, it's a very easy sin to deal with. If you just don't have a phone or you don't have a laptop, you've basically solved the problem. And it's hard. It's really, really hard. You don't want to minimize how incredibly difficult it is for a lot of people to break those addictions. But I would say, looking at images on screens and videos on screens is an easy problem to solve. The real problem is lust beneath that. And you carry that around with you, even if you've gotten rid of all of the pathways towards pornography. And I thought of that recently when I was reading a theologian, and he was talking about how do you classify different kinds of sins. And he said, well, he called them animal sins, and then there are spiritual sins. There are the sins of the flesh, and there are the sins of the spirit. And the sins of the flesh being things like gluttony, materialism, overconsumption. Sins of the spirit being things like pride, covetousness, arrogance, rage, bitterness. And it really hit me hard. He said, the spiritual sins are much worse, and they're much more dangerous, and they're much more destructive. And I thought, oh, wow. In the Bitcoin world, we talk a lot about things like, oh, you got to get physically healthy, and we're going to eat good, and, we're going to improve our material well-being. And we focus quite a bit on these vices of the flesh, which we should, and they are important, and they do harm people. But they're not nearly as destructive and nearly as bad as the sins of the spirit. And thought, whoa, there's a lot more for us to focus on here. You've barely gone very far if you've gotten really physically fit and you eat a great diet and you have a great physical environment and good architecture around you. There are all kinds of much deeper spiritual sins that you will spend the rest of your life fighting with, even if you have Bitcoin and everyone's living on it around you.
Yeah, that's right. Even if Bitcoin fully succeeds in its vision, that's where I can't be utopian.
Right.
It's just not. It's not going to solve for, and it might in some ways make some sins worse. Especially if I'm proud of the accomplishment that we've had with Bitcoin. But it's a daily exercise to combat that.
All right. Well, thanks, Pierre, for coming on today. Appreciate it. Do you want to give everybody any tips of where to find you or what you're up to these days?
I spend too much time on X, so at Bitcoin Pierre is where to find me, and my DMs are open if you ever want to chat there.
Okay, great. Well, thanks, Pierre. Look forward to talking again. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Tim. Bye.